I want to welcome you to Between Skepticism and Mysticism, an introduction to the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. This entire lecture series on the foundations of the occult philosophy is brought to you totally free of charge, completely open access by the incredibly generous folks that support my work over at my Patreon. This is all a bit of an experiment on providing free content through crowdsourcing education on topics that are just honestly rarely taught in universities at all. And when they are taught, a single class can cost thousands of dollars. If you'd like to support the production of university level open access education and topics in Western esotericism, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, which you can join for as little as $54 a year. It's like buying me a cup of coffee or a beer once a month. But thank you so much for your consideration of supporting the channel and the work like this, and thanks to the patrons of this channel for making this lecture series possible. All right, everyone, welcome back to the ongoing seminar on Agrippa's occult philosophy. And we're sort of in the, I don't want to call it exactly the lull, but we're in sort of the between place between the composition of the three books of occult philosophy in 1510 and the publication and composition of the De Incertitudine, or the De Vanitate, ever how do you want to call it, the skeptical attack that Agrippa is going to launch beginning in the summer of 1526. And one of the things that I think that I'm really excited about in this seminar is that we're getting to cover the material that typically does not get covered at all, which is to say the increasingly hermetic and mystical texts that represent the period between 1510 and 1526. That's 16 years. It's 16 years worth of time that has passed where Agrippa has not stopped thinking. He has not stopped writing. He has not stopped lecturing. And it is in that period that we've seen so far that Agrippa is deepening, in fact, his interest in Hermeticism. He's deepening his interest in Kabbalah. He's writing explicitly, as we'll see today, deeply Hermetic tracts in the period around 1518. And so we're seeing a deepening of his interest in this material. And when we get to the 1526 so-called skeptical turn next, we'll get to it next week, we're going to see that this is a much more complicated business than just Agrippa abandons his interest in mysticism, or his interest in the occult, or his interest in magic, for instance. And we're going to have to do a little situating to understand what's going on with this very strange and very interesting 1526 skeptical attack that he launches in the De Incertitudine. But today I want to turn to what I think is probably the most important book that he composed during this period. It's not the longest thing that he composed during this period. And that text is the threefold way of knowing God, the De Triplici Ratione. This text is the most polished, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, but it is the most polished essay or tractate that Agrippa wrote between the 1510 three books of occult philosophy and the 1526 um, and the 1526 De Incertitudine, the skeptical attack. And that's with one exception. We'll talk about it in a minute. This commentary on Raimondo Lull's Ars Brevis, which there's some debate about when exactly it was written, but I'll come back to that in just a moment. This text on the threefold way of knowing God is, without any doubt in my mind, the most hermetic book Agrippa ever composed. In fact, virtually every line of the book, especially as you get into reading it, and especially when you learn to read between the lines in the way, for instance, that Dan Trell has done in a magnificent way in his translation that we're working on, virtually every line of the threefold way of knowing God is a reference to the Corpus Hermeticum. There's just, the Corpus Hermeticum is like built into the text in a way that makes this, I think, one of the most authentically, clearly Hermetic texts, along with Lodovico Lazzarelli's Crater Hermetis, produced in the entirety of the Renaissance. And this will, of course, be, like I said, available in translation here in the next in the next coming weeks, as Dan and I wrap up this translation project. But what the text contains is an analysis of how the intellect, And again, when I say intellect here, I mean the mens, the mens and the ratio. Remember, for Agrippa, the mens is a part of the mind that is connected to the divine. The ratio of the mind is a part of you that kind of does consciousness at some level. It's the part of you that is you. It is how that ratio comes to know God. What are the various mechanisms by which that ratio can come to know God? And further, it is the mechanism by which one can guide the mind through various forms of knowing toward the goal of illumination. And again, as I pointed out last week, this is true also of this week's material that we'll be discussing. Agrippa has not fundamentally broken with the ideas of the 1510. Remember, the 1510 Three Books of Occult Philosophy has so much more to do with mere magic. Rather, the goal is illumination. And the idea that Agrippa is driving home here is the exact same kind of stuff. He's still fundamentally interested in the process of illumination, but now he's digging a bit deeper down into the kind of mechanisms by which this happens in the intellect. And interestingly enough, also, he's doing a bit of religious anthropology. He's showing how this form of illumination has existed through time and how various peoples through time have been able to access, in varying degrees, of course, the divine through their various customs and practices. Now, again, this should be unsurprising to everyone. This is not an idea about how to come to know God rationally or know God via dialectic. It's nothing like that. In fact, Agrippa will come out really swinging against the dialecticians in the threefold way of knowing God. In fact, he'll say, as we'll see, that dialectic is invented by the devil, and therefore, not only is it not a way of coming to know God, it is in fact a massive impediment in coming to know God, and much to the chagrin, I imagine, of the scholastics. But again, here we mean know in the sense of how to know in an illuminated sense. It is not knowing propositions. It is not knowing that God is three persons, that God is one God, that God was born to a woman and was incarnated in Christ. It is not knowing that. It is knowing as a mode of being, as a Heideggerian, we might say, way of being. It is a way of engaging with the divine through the medium of the mind, and that connection of the mind with the divine is what he means here by knowing. So again, we're not trying to gather up a bunch of propositions and prove a bunch of stuff with dialectic. We have to separate ourselves out from this propositional way of gaining information. We must separate ourselves away from that, because Agrippa's not talking about that. He's talking about how the mind communes with the divine, right? How the mind communes with the divine. And again, we're going to see this in both a historical order, beginning with paganism and with knowledge of nature, all the way through to the knowledge of the gospel. So we both have a historiography of the ways by which we know God, and we have a qualitative story by which one can come to know God through better and better and better forms. And those also track, as we'll see, to increasingly esoteric forms of divine knowledge. The first form of knowing God is something we might recognize as paganism, which is to say that one comes to know God via nature, or rather to say, one comes to know the true being by studying beings. And so by studying beings, and this is a bit of a point also made by Ibn Rushd, that we can study beings, and by studying beings, we can come to know the truth about being. We can even come to know the rules by which being is governed by studying the beings that populate being itself. So by studying nature, we come to know that, for instance, that there is a God, and by studying nature, we come to know things about God. However, Agrippa thinks that unlike uh, other forms of knowing God, these lead to pretty limited horizons. They lead to pretty limited horizons. So they can lead to piety, right? This can lead to piety, which is just to say one can recognize from nature that there is a God of nature, and one can cultivate a sense of awe or piety to that God. And I think that's relatively obvious that if you've ever been out in nature and experienced the sublime in nature, whether it's in the sublime in the form of seeing a mountain or an exquisite animal or something like that, one can experience a deep sense of awe, and that deep sense of awe can lead one to worship the originator of nature, even if you don't know any of the particulars about that originator. And further, not Spinoza, but Spinoza will agree actually. Agrippa will argue that this can also lead you to moral justice. You can develop a moral sense by studying nature and seeing how nature works. And by studying this, you can develop some sense of what we might consider the natural law. And by following the natural law, this allows one to cultivate a sense of moral justice. So even a religion that is ignorant of the actual divine being, the actual God, and a religion which is fundamentally devoid of theophany or revelation. And again, this is a very Abrahamic centric, Christ centric vision of how history is going to develop. Hegel is going to say something very similar in a couple centuries. The idea is, even from the ignorance of the divine world, God has not revealed God's self, nor revealed the divine law. Agrippa comes to the conclusion that one can develop a sense of piety and moral justice simply by communing with nature. And also, very importantly, Agrippa contends that the pagan communion with nature, we can think of something, imagine Agrippa has something in mind a bit like the Druids or the Neoplatonic philosophers of the ancient pagan world. But the idea is their worship, even though the worship is fundamentally quote unquote pagan, is still on Agrippan terms acceptable to God. Why? Because God is a God of grace. God bestows God's grace upon creation. God bestows God's grace upon human beings. And that allows even people who are worshiping God perhaps in a incorrect way, maybe even in an offensive way. They're sacrificing animals to God in a way that they're not supposed to be or something like that. The divine grace overrides, in some sense, divine justice, and God is accepting of this piety and sense of moral justice. And there is a sense in which, even in this way, one can commune with God. There is there is a possibility of communion with God via grace by studying nature. This is sometimes referred to, by the way, as the tendency toward universal religiosity. Universal religiosity is the idea that, and this is from a Christian centric point of view, that even people that, for instance, do not follow Christianity or have not heard the revelation of the gospel, they're still able to commune with God and, in some sense, escape damnation because of divine grace and because they've managed to cultivate a sense of piety and moral justice. If you've ever heard dilemmas of, like, what happens to Native Americans who've never heard of the gospel before, blah, 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 the answer from the idea of universal religiosity is that they are able to develop a sense of religiosity. They are able to develop a sense of moral justice. And insofar as they cultivate and follow that sense of piety and moral justice, divine grace overrides divine judgment, and they are sufficiently rightly guided so as to be accepted by God. But this is insufficient, unfortunately, for true goodness and true felicity. So you're not going to be able to achieve true felicity in this sort of quote unquote pagan way of engaging with the divine. I'm sure that Plotinus would happily disagree with the fact that you could not achieve felicity, given that Plotinus seems to have certainly achieved felicity, moreover, and against Agrippa, who is questionable whether he achieved it. Plotinus certainly seemed to have had. But for Agrippa, this is insufficient, right? It's insufficient. And therefore, it needs to pave the way for the second way of coming to know God, and that is via theophany, which is to say, God must appear in history, and the appearance in history takes the form of the revelation of the divine law. And the divine law is the next way that Agrippa argues that people can come to know God. Of course, this is the Torah given to the ancient people of Israel. But this is where things become interesting. Things now split into sort of exoteric and esoteric dimensions of the revelation. Agrippa doesn't seem to think that there's much of an esoteric dimension of studying nature, despite the fact that he clearly believes there is an esoteric dimension of studying nature in the form of all the occult sympathies and all the occult things that go on in nature. So I don't know if this is just an oversight or he's just not that interested in talking about it, but clearly the occult philosophy that dominates in book one of the three books of occult philosophy is all underwritten by the fact that there is a huge esoteric dimension to nature. In fact, in the dialogue on man, Agrippa even talks about the fact that there's arcana hidden in nature. And there are certain natural philosophers who are able to seek out that arcana hidden in physical terrestrial nature. But of the exoteric Torah, right? This is the law of God, which is to say, all those thou shalt and thou shalt nots that you have in the Hebrew Bible, the 613 commandments of the Hebrew Bible. That is the exoteric Torah. In addition, of course, to the exoteric Torah, there is the esoteric Torah, and that, of course, is the Kabbalah. Now, the Kabbalah allows one a higher form of knowing God. Of course, Agrippa thinks that many Jews become so attached to the exoteric Torah that they forego the esoteric Torah, and even the Jews who do have access to the esoteric Torah and the Kabbalah don't fully really understand it, and therefore they're sort of carrying it around and not really realizing what they have their hands on. But the esoteric Torah in the form of the Kabbalah leads again to a higher state of knowing God. But the Mosaic law in both its forms, both the exoteric and the esoteric Kabbalah, of course, is a propedeutic. It is a preparation for what you can easily imagine has got to come next. It's the gospel, right? It's the gospel, which is to say the good news of the incarnation of Jesus, of God in the form of Jesus as both fully man and fully human, two natures in one person. But what's interesting for Agrippa is that Agrippa thinks that there is also a kind of exoteric and a kind of esoteric gospel. The esoteric gospel or the exoteric gospel is the gospel that we all know. And that gospel, right, is the ones found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the sacraments bound up from the teachings of Jesus, ensconced in the authority of the church. All of that machinery is, interestingly enough, for Agrippa, the exoteric gospel. All the stuff about transubstantiation, all the stuff about the Trinity, all of the official, you can think of them as the sort of as the creedal Christianity, all those stuff packed into the creeds of Christianity in the form of something like the Nicene Creed, all of that is exoteric gospel. The esoteric gospel should be, I think, also somewhat unsurprising, an occult gospel, this hidden gospel. All of that, as you probably will also surmise, is, for instance, all those Kabbalistic, Hermetic, Prisca Theologia truths that have been revealed very slowly over time, very slowly through different people like Hermes Trismegistus, like people like Zoroaster, like in the form of the Kabbalah. All of those esoteric dimensions are also built into this esoteric elements of the gospel, and those ways of knowing God are going to be the forms that ultimately allow for felicity. So in some sense, the exoteric gospel is sufficient for salvation. The esoteric gospel is going to be what's going to propel you in the direction of illumination and felicity, felicitas. So notice that as a Christian, you can follow just the exoteric gospel and you're going to go to heaven. You're going to eventually experience bliss and paradise and everything when you die. But the hardcore Christians, the Christians, of course, like Agrippa, are going to be interested in achieving salvation via the exoteric gospel, but then digging deeper into this esoteric dimension of Christianity using things like Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and Pythagoreanism, and on the whole lot of it, combining those into the system, of course, that Agrippa has already outlined back in 1510. And this is going to be the mechanism by which one eventually achieves illumination and felicitas. So what's, again, interesting here is we're getting a glimpse at some level into Agrippa's religious historiography, the process by which religion is sort of revealed in history, and by which the human being is given a greater and greater and greater access to communion with the divine. But also we're getting a glimpse into kind of how he thinks about Christianity more generally, and we're getting a sense of, this is how Christianity works, that there is a exoteric dimension of Christianity sufficient for salvation, but there's also this other dimension of Christianity by which one can kind of upgrade one's soul, so to speak, in order to achieve illumination and eventually illumination and felicitas. Now, what's interesting about this is that this will inaugurate at some level. Already, we see it a little bit in Ludovico Lazzarelli and his Hermetic Christianity. but we're already seeing the foundations of what will become the kinds of esoteric Christianities that will eventually spring upon the world in the form of things like Jakob Burma and Theosophy, things like Swedenborgianism, but also esoteric Christianities. For instance, the Latter-day Saints movement, the Mormon Church, has a highly esoteric dimension, where very esoteric dimensions of its spirituality. And along with that, things like spiritualism, Christian spiritualism, all of these forms of esoteric Christianity are at some level being inaugurated by thinkers like Agrippa, because they're allowing for the possibility that everything that the church is teaching is right, but there's a deeper story to be told, and that deeper story to be told doesn't give you salvation. It's sort of like what you have to get after you've already gone what is done what's sufficient for salvation, but it opens the door to esoteric dimensions of Christianity. Now, what's going to happen, of course, and we don't have time to get into it, but what's going to transpire over the course of the next several centuries is that um, we're going to basically abandon the thing that Agrippa is saying here, that exoteric Christianity is sufficient for salvation. Ultimately, what's going to end up happening is they're going to drop that, right? The Protestant Reformation is going to take hold. There's going to be a dozen, thousand little forms of Christianity. And the church, of course, is no longer going to have monopoly on salvation. Salvation is going to be a completely interiorized, faith-based matter. After the success of the Protestant movement, and therefore esoteric Christianity is going to do the heavy lifting of both esoteric and exoteric Christianity, and you're going to have lots of different versions of Christianity, esoteric Christianities that will proliferate in the period, in the centuries after Agrippa. But here, at least, Agrippa is still holding on to two things at once. He's still holding on to the necessity of the church's orthodoxy and the church as the gatekeeper to salvation, but also he's saying, in addition to that, right, there's the ultimate Christian side quest, and the ultimate Christian side quest is illumination and felicity. And if you want to do that, here's all these esoteric resources by which to do this. Now, what isn't knowing God is what I mentioned earlier. It is not dialectic. You're not going to rationalize your way to the divine. Agrippa rejects that in the strongest terms in his entire career, literally says that dialectic, that rational argumentation about the divine, is literally invented by the devil. It is satanic. It's not just inferior, it's not just misguided, that at some level, the thing that the scholastics are attempting to do, coming to know the truth about God via reason, via propositional knowledge, via logic, Agrippa basically says not only is this not going to work, not only is it an improper thing to do, it is in some sense devilish. It is some sense satanic. And so Agrippa is really coming down extremely hard on the scholastics. I have to admit, I have a bit of a soft spot for the scholastics, but Agrippa's coming down here saying definitively, this dialectic is the mechanism by which one will not, at the end of the day, get you there, and it will in fact alienate you further from God. So the threefold way of knowing God, despite the fact that it is a highly Christian text, it is a very, supersessionist kind of theology, which that may make some people very uncomfortable. We know the history of religious supersessionism can be quite dangerous. Again, we should never take Agrippa out of his own historical framework. But at the same time, this is a work that is extraordinarily hermetic, extraordinarily dedicated to the Prisca Theologia, and is absolutely dripping on virtually every single page with the importance of the esoteric dimension of Christianity, and arguing polemically against the various kinds of scholasticism that Agrippa thinks is deeply alienating of God. Now, I think that Agrippa must have had some anxiety about this book. It may have been a little bit too hermetic. And so we know that Agrippa never published it early on. He's writing it sometime in the around 1518, I think. He doesn't ultimately publish it at that time. He reworks it. He greatly expands it. Again, it shows us that Agrippa is still pretty dedicated to the work, and he ultimately does publish it during the Antwerp period. So Agrippa has an early draft. He reworks it, adds a lot to it, and publishes it ultimately later. Further, I think a reason why he had some anxiety around this work is that at the very end of it, basically he includes just a full version of the Nicene Creed. At the very end of the book, he says, yes, you can know all this stuff about God, you can get all this esoteric knowledge, and then you need to be real careful that you believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, who made everything visible. He just goes through the whole creed, just so that you basically read through the creed at the end, and you're like, okay, orthodoxy, right? Orthodoxy carries the day. And this is a, does Agrippa have to do this because he's worried about the orthodoxy of the text? Is he worried about the Inquisition? I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is that he has some orthodox worries about it, and it's always better to begin on orthodoxy, end on orthodoxy, and do a bunch of weird stuff in the middle. Because if you do all the weird stuff in the middle, in some level, by the end of it, you can kind of walk out the back door being like, well, I'm still cool, right? Cool, right? Like, still orthodox. One God, maker of everything visible and invisible. He's just real about that invisible part. The invisible part is the part that Agrippa likes. And so that's the place where I think Agrippa is, again, he leans heavy at the end of the text, and he ends it with a pretty creedal formula. But again, Agrippa is still being pretty radical during this period. Now, I just picked out a line from here at the very end of the dialogue on love, or the commentary on love, that I picked out last time. Um, and Agrippa is saying pretty radical stuff. From my Latin readers, he ends the dialogue on love, which was written at the same time as this. And this is the highest felicitas for human beings. It is namely to become God. To become God. This is theosis. This is not communion with God. When I say communion, I want you to hear the Latin underlying term of that, communion, to become one with. And in some sense, the distinction between oneself and God collapses. And that last line, right? Deum scalecit fieri, to become, namely God. That is the ultimate, the highest summit of human felicity, is to become God. Now, again, this is the kind of thing that I don't know what degree of a creedal formula you can repeat at the end of something like that to get you out of trouble, but this is extremely radical theosis. That the kind of thing that you could hear in maybe in an Eastern Orthodox kind of setting in some ways, but again, a quite radical statement at the end of the section on love. To do this, because again, remember back to the idea that the lover, the beloved, and the process of love, it's all love for Agrippa, right? And so once you become so in love with love, all that is left is love. And if you become in love with love, and God is love, and you are drowned in that love, well, there's nothing else but just God. You've broken down the alienation completely. So at any rate, the threefold way of knowing God, while not a terribly long text, I think in our translation, the translation that Dan did, it's all of about 15 pages. So it's not a terribly long book. It's a book in 6 chapters, but it is a text that is uniquely hermetic and uniquely pitching an idea of esoteric Christianity that I think is quite phenomenal. And I'm really looking forward to folks having access to read it here and the next month or so, when we can get this this edition out. Now, 1515 is a pretty important year in the history of the publication of Hermetic and late pagan mystical texts. 1515 is the year in which the Aldine Press, and I have the table of contents there. The Aldine Press in 1515 rolls out what is, in my opinion, and this is a place where I'll say my opinion, and you can believe me or not, or challenge me. In 1515, the Aldine Press rolls out one of the greatest compilations of what we might call esoteric literature in history. So this text includes things like the Corpus Hermeticum, and it includes Iamblichus's book on the Egyptian mysteries. It includes Proclus's commentaries and Proclus's book on sacrifice and magic. It contains some Porphyry. It contains On Demons by Michael Sellis. It contains the Asclepius. It contains all the major sections from Ficino that are specifically about magic and mysticism. It is a real whiz-bang collection of the who's who of late classical paganism and mysticism and magic, ending, of course, or containing the Corpus Hermeticum and Iamblichus's on the Egyptian mysteries. I don't think it's any accident that Agrippa is living in Italy when this comes out in 1515, when it's first printed, and we see this explosion in Agrippa's interest in this kind of material. So this book comes out in 1515. I think there's something incredibly important about this. And so again, very important text, but there's a very conspicuous thing missing in all of this literature we've been talking about through the 1515 period and the Italian period more generally, and we'll see this even later, is Agrippa basically never talks about magic. Kabbalah takes center stage. Hermeticism really takes center stage. But Agrippa basically never mentions magic in any of the literature from this time period, with one exception, I think. And I'll have to be more careful and read this. But to my knowledge, Agrippa mentions magic once and only once. He mentions it to mention that both magic and Kabbalah have both become defamed. And he mentions it in the threefold way of knowing God. He says both magic and Kabbalah have become profane and suspect. That's it. So we go from 1510, where magic is really the star of the show, and we go from 1510 to now 1515, 1516, 1517, 1518. Magic's disappeared from the stage. Now, I have some ideas about why magic has disappeared from the stage. I have some theories, and I'll lay some of those out. But there could be a lot of things going on here. The first, it could actually be, is that Agrippa's actually just changed his position on magic. He's maintained his position on Prisca Theologia. He's maintained his position on Kabbalah. He's maintained his position on Hermeticism. Maybe he's just shifted his position on magic. And I think that one of the things that might explain that, if it were true, and I don't know that it is that it could be the influence of John Colet. Remember that John Colet is a very important religious thinker living in London. The Agrippa goes to London. He studies under John Colet. That's where he seems to have written his very famous, now lost commentary on the book of Romans. And seems like he comes back from that experience from John Colet, who had apparently a very deep and important impact on him. Colet, we know, was very skeptical of magic. He was very on board to some degree with Ficino and with Pico and with Reuchlin. He knew those guys, but the one thing he was very skeptical of, we know that Colet was very skeptical of magic. So it's possible that the 23-year-old, 24-year-old Agrippa goes to London, goes to England, very enthusiastic about magic, and Colet disabuses him of that. He keeps the rest, but magic, for whatever reason, goes under the bus. I think that's a possible answer. I don't know, but that's something that strikes me as at least possible. But notice what hasn't changed. Notice that while Agrippa is not talking about magic much anymore, if at all, we'll come back to a document in which we will be talking about divination at length when we come back next week. But notice what has not changed, and that is the goal of felicity and illumination. Agrippa has, in many ways, continued to deepen his knowledge of Kabbalah and Hermeticism to increase and thicken and build out his commitment to illumination and felicity, right? He's deepening those interests. So at some level, the goal, as stated in the third book of occult philosophy, that goal is completely intact. But the place of doing magic as part of that goal seems to have now gone almost basically radio silent. Now, another reason that Agrippa might not be talking about magic is he's in Italy. He's in the heartland of an area where it's not quite arisen yet. The Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, has not arisen yet. It's coming, but the Inquisition as a medieval instrument is still there. In Italy, the church has a lot more power, right? He's not in Metz, where he will be next, where the church is going to have a lot weaker power. The Catholic Church is much more powerful there, and a lot of the documents that we're reading from these sections are public lectures and orations. It could be the case that maybe Agrippa's just wised up, frankly, and he's not giving public lectures and public orations on magic. He's already pushing the boundaries, I would say, when he's giving the Pavia lecture on the Corpus Hermeticum and basically publicly arguing things like Pymander is Jesus, and he's revealed some kind of proto-gospel, some kind of proto-revelation to Hermes Trismegistus, and that literature is a kind of precursor to the Gospels ultimately revealed by Jesus on the earth. So he's already doing some pretty avant-garde stuff in the Pymander lecture. He's writing some pretty, again, deepening his interest in esoteric Christianity and the threefold way of knowing God. So maybe this is just prudence. Maybe the radio silence we're getting about magic is just a matter of prudence. And one reason to believe that is that when we do get to the 1533, three books of occult philosophy, if they were simply a rehashing of the magical sections, especially the sections of ceremonial magic, if those were just rehashed from the 1510 and then transferred from the 1510 into the 1533, I think one could make the argument that Agrippa had abandoned his interest in magic. We don't see that. The sections on magic, including planetary magic, including sigil magic, including ceremonial magic, all get expanded in the 1533. So the radio silence here is interesting. It's conspicuous, but I don't think it's because Agrippa's lost all interest in magic. I think that something is happening here. So it's some combination perhaps of he shifted his focus, perhaps under the influence of someone like John Colet, or he's just wised up and he's not going in public, right, and saying a bunch of stuff about how you can use magic to come to know God, right? So maybe it's some combination of the two. I don't know. I think it's worth noticing. Again, when you talk about text, it's all, what isn't said is all often just as interesting as what is said. And here, like I said, conspicuously during this period, the text on magic get turned down. In fact, we'll see in many cases some of these documents will shift anti-magic, and we'll see that especially next week in the 1526 De Incertitudine, and in some of private letters, which Dan is translating, where Dan is talking privately to some of his friends and saying some pretty hostile things about the practice of magic. So we'll take a look at those starting not next week, but the week after, I think. Agrippa also composes during this period, 1517, 1518, a commentary on Raimondo Lull's Ars Brevis. Now, I'm not sure this was actually composed during this period, but I'll come back and say why I think that in just a minute. But as folks probably know, Raimondo Lull's Ars Brevis is a summary of the larger edition of the Lullian art. And the Lullian art is basically a mechanism of combinatory, almost computer-like mechanisms by which one can come to know things about the world and know things about God. So basically, it's almost like a computer, like an analog computer. You plug in a bunch of ideas and you kind of rotate these various mechanisms and you do these various logical calculations. And what drops out of all those logical calculations are all kinds of facts about nature and the divine and all this kind of stuff. So Lull basically had the idea that he could go to Muslim lands and he could use the combinatory system to convince the Muslims of all kinds of things about the nature of God, convince them the truth of Christianity, convince them of the truth of the Trinity, and he could use this computational system to do this. Most people who came to know the Lullian system came to know it in an abbreviated form called the Ars Brevis, and the Ars Brevis is basically the shortened, compressed version of the Lullian art. Agrippa at some point has composed a commentary on the Ars Brevis, in which Agrippa seems to one agree with Lull that this computational system can in fact deliver these kinds of propositional truths about nature and God. And even more shocking, Agrippa says in the foreword to the text that he can deduce these truths without reference to scripture, right? He says it doesn't require the testimony of the sciences, vel scriptaturum. It doesn't also, you don't need to have scripture as in the mechanism by which to testify to these truths. So that sounds very strange, because that is something that Agrippa would not say in 1515, 1518. Agrippa is very hardcore about the Bible and how the Bible is the only thing that really vouchsafes truths, and you have to trust in the Bible and have this kind of almost existentialist relationship to the gospel and the Bible. So already this is sounding a little bit weird given the time period. And also, Agrippa seems to be very, very optimistic of the power of the human mind to know all of this data generated by the computational system of the Lullian art. Now, none of this sounds like Agrippa in 1515. This sounds like something Agrippa just wouldn't say. Agrippa's very skeptical and increasingly skeptical of the power of the human mind. Agrippa really, if Agrippa dislikes the idea of scholastic arguments by which to know things about God, how in the world would he trust basically an analog computer to just generate truths about the divine or about nature? So there's two things that could possibly be going on here. One, it could be the case that the Lullian art itself, Agrippa sees, and Lull probably thought of it this way too. And so maybe Agrippa's following Lull and just not saying it, that the Lullian art is itself somehow the result of illumination. That is to say, the Lullian art was revealed by God to Raimondo Lull, and God revealed the Lullian art to Raimondo Lull as a mechanism by which to, one, deepen the faith of Christians, not give faith to Christians, but deepen that faith, and also as a mechanism to combat heresy. Recall that Agrippa does say things like, yeah, dialectic's bad, but back in the day when it was like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus, it was good because you could use it to combat heretics. So back then it was okay, but now it's all corrupt and degenerate and profligate and bad. So what might be going on here between the lines is that Agrippa is thinking that the Lullian system can generate these truths because it is in fact kind of encoded those truths in the system, and the system is itself divinely revealed. And therefore, it's the illuminated mind that receives these these truths otherwise generated through the combinational system, and therefore he just doesn't mention that because it's taken for granted that of course the Lullian system is divinely revealed. I should also mention that Raimondo Lull was targeted explicitly by the Inquisition, specifically the Inquisitor Nicholas Emmerich, because Emmerich really thought that the Lullian system was satanic, that the devil had revealed it to Lull to destroy faith, because if you can just compute knowledge about God, you don't need the church to tell you the truth, and you don't need faith because you'll have it all revealed to you in the same way that a computer can just reveal to you. Chat GPT basically can just reveal scripture to you. Nicholas Emmerich thought this was terrible, and he targeted Lull and Lullians as what he thought of as some of the worst of heretics. Lull, again, on the other hand, thought it was revealed by God. So maybe the one thing is that Agrippa is on this Lullian kick because he thinks that illumination is sort of a foregone conclusion for how the Lullian system will work. And yes, if you're curious, I am going to be making an episode on the Lullian system at some point soon because it is absolutely fascinating and weird and cool, and it's basically like a computer before there are computers. It's really, really fascinating. I think another possibility that might explain this otherwise very weird text in relationship to a lot of, and this is a very long text, by the way. It's just 60, 70 pages long. It's a very long, involved text. Nauert actually puts forward the argument in a footnote and doesn't really follow it. And I tend to think this is an important footnote, is that this might have been written when Agrippa was much younger. That we know that in the University of Cologne, one of the most famous and most important Lullians that was around at that time was one of Agrippa's teachers. And he would have learned, we know he learned the Lullian art from that teacher. And it's possible, and now it seems to forward this idea, and I think it's eminently possible, that Agrippa has actually written this as a young man. He maybe wrote it as basically an undergraduate when he was much, much more optimistic about the power of the human mind. And what he's basically doing now is reworking it with some of his more illuminationist beliefs. And he's combining some more of these illuminationist beliefs with this more juvenile kind of text that he wrote while he was at the University of Cologne. And perhaps it's just now getting out. And so the dating is wrong. It wasn't written in 1515. It was written sometime before 1510. I don't know if that's a good answer either, but this just doesn't sound like the Agrippa of 1517, 1518. This sounds like the Agrippa of perhaps a much younger man, and that this might be an undergraduate work that Agrippa has reworked at some level or has changed or something. But at any rate, it is an important text. It needs to get translated at some point. It is massive. And I think that in many ways, part of the reason why we didn't elect to translate this is, one, it would take too long. And two, it requires you to know so much about the Lullian art that most people don't know anything about the Lullian art. And I'm not an expert in the Lullian art. that to translate it accurately, we would have to just basically do an entire course on law to make sure we're getting Agrippa's commentary on law correct. At any rate, what is important, I would say, about this text is the introduction, and it's in the introduction, for instance, that Agrippa claims that the Lullian art is able, and he says things like "cartissimus." It is able to generate knowledge that is most true. Cartissimus. And he uses all these superlatives in the introduction, and he will say things like, "It can generate this stuff." In that line that I found, "Idioque non indigita leorum scientarum," it's able to generate knowledge without reference to other sources and without reference to scripture. The testimony of scripture, I found that to be shocking, and just the kind of thing that I cannot imagine Agrippa in 1517, 1518 from saying. So at any rate, what is it? Is it a text that's uncharacteristically Agrippan? Possibly. Is it something he wrote as a young man? I think that's also possible, but an important text on the Lullian art. It's also worth noting that Giordano Bruno will also write a commentary on the Ars Brevis. Bruno's commentary on the Ars Brevis is also deeply indebted to Agrippa's, and both of them are published often both of them are published as the second volume of the complete works of Raimondo Lull in pre-modern editions. So typically, if you got a copy of the Lullian art in the Opera Omnia, you would also get in the second volume. It's typically bound together in one big thick volume in octavo. You would get both Agrippa's and Bruno's commentary on the Lullian art, and Bruno's commentary is, like I said, indebted to Agrippa's. So at the end of this, the Italian period, Agrippa he's gotten married, he's had some kids, he's had an extraordinarily productive time period. Unfortunately, war has intervened and stopped his lectures at Pavia, and so unfortunately, the lectures on the Corpus Hermeticum have come to an end. We do know, again, he's deepening his interest in Hermeticism. He's deepening his interest in Kabbalah, so much so that he's befriending people, actively doing the work of translating Kabbalah. Think of someone like Paolo Resius, who Agrippa didn't know him, but he did know Augustino, Paolo Resius's brother. Other small texts that Agrippa will write at this time, when he ultimately gets to Metz around 1518. Metz, as you may know, was a hotbed of proto-Protestantism. And so many of Agrippa's friends, almost all of Agrippa's friends at Metz, are going to be somewhere in the orbit of the early Protestant movement. And there, Agrippa is going to dedicate, he's ultimately going to write one text there on original sin. And the text on original sin, interestingly enough, does two things. One, it argues that sin, the original sin, was sexual intercourse. It was carnalum copulum. It was having sex. That was the original sin. This kind of alarmed many of Agrippa's friends. In fact, several of Agrippa's friends wrote him saying, like, "Hey, you should not publish that. That is not a good idea to publish that, because that seems to contravene scripture," which is to say, scripture makes it really clear that the original sin was disobedience, which is to say, God told Adam not to eat. The snake convinces Eve, who, by the way, God had not told anything. She eats the fruit, then convinces her husband to do it, or her, I guess, husband, whatever. And he eats it knowing that he shouldn't have done it. And it's the consumption of that fruit that's supposed to be the original sin. Agrippa does a kind of esoteric reading here, where there is a two-layer esoteric reading. The first layer of the esoteric reading is that it was sexual intercourse. And Agrippa reads that not as sexual intercourse in the sense of just having sex, because that's not obviously sinful in itself, but that somehow Eve and Adam were lusting for each other, that it was a kind of intercourse born out of fornicatio. And so if you remember back from last week, Agrippa's written already a commentary on Ficino's commentary on the Plato's Symposium about love, and recall that in that text, Agrippa had a very, very bad place in his mind for lust. He thought that because love was bound up with God, God is love according to the Gospel of John, and that love was both a means by which to come to know God, but also kind of a way of getting access to God via love. Again, an idea that goes back to the 1510. If one perverts love and transforms it into lust, in some sense, you're taking the most divine thing and you're making it sinful. And that kind of perversion, fornicatio, is for Agrippa a sin of special horror. And it's a sin of a special horror because it's taking the very thing that we are supposed to engage with God, God is love, through God, through the avenue of love, and then perverting it. And the sin of fornicatio is for Agrippa especially terrifying. He seems to place, again, now, of course, fornication and other kinds of lust, or of course, it's a seven deadly sin. But in general, the seven deadly sins are all kind of equal in some sense. Agrippa seems to believe that lust is an especially evil kind of sin. So this argument, right, that the original sin was fornicatio, was carnal copulation, I guess you could translate it literally there from the Latin. That is where, again, we're seeing some conversation between this work on original sin and his earlier work on love. Now, the thing about this work on original sin is that Agrippa is not doing a lot of that heavy lifting about the nature of love. I think the reason why this is so shocking is that if you read Agrippa's book on original sin, you don't get the huge importance, the metaphysical centrality of love in his system, and all you get is, oh yeah, the original sin is carnal copulation. Yeah, that doesn't sound like anything of any significance, and it sounds weird until you understand Agrippa's already built this entire metaphysics, this entire theology, this entire epistemology of love back a couple of years earlier. And it's into that circumstance that I think the idea that carnal copulation as the original sin makes a bit more sense as much as it does. Now, there's a secondary layer, a secondary esoteric reading of the De Peccatum, the De Origine Peccatum. That second earlier level, and I've mentioned this in earlier lectures, is that Adam, Eve, and the snake don't represent just themselves. There's a lower allegorical reading here. And these kind of allegorical readings are typical both in the Christian history of reading text, but also in the Jewish history of reading text, in which things can operate at various levels in the text. And there's kind of a hidden esoteric dimension here. But that here, Adam represents fides. He represents faith, stable, constant faith in God. Right. So again, Adam is kind of has a bit of a naive faith, but a faith in God. Eve represents ratio libera, ratio like a free reason. As you can imagine, Agrippa has a very low opinion of free reason. And again, why does Eve represent free reason? She represents free reason because she's intercoursing with the snake, and this intercourse with the snake, in some sense, in Kabbalah, is understood to be both sexual, but also there's a dialogue. Notice Adam never really dialogues with God. Adam listens to God, and Adam dialogues with nature. He names things in nature, but Eve is really the first character where we have what? We have dialectic. We have the snake and Eve arguing. The snake says, hey, do this, and Eve says this, and there's a kind of back and forth. Eve represents ratio libera, free reason. Now, of course, what does free reason do? It mucks things up, right? Eve uses reason and goes over there and argues with Adam and convinces Adam over and against his faith to eat the fruit. Now, again, all the misogyny stuff that we know is baked into all of this is there. But at any rate, that's Agrippa's reasoning there. And what is the snake? The snake is desire, sensuality, sensualitas in the Latin. The snake is sensual desire. And so what the argument here is that Eve, in some sense, has been tricked by the snake to convert what is otherwise a healthy, spiritually good form of sensuality or of sexuality that has become corrupted, and she basically seduces Adam, and they engage in carnal lust, fornicatio, and therefore that is the nature of the original sin. And this has three effects. The physical effect is that we die. That's the first physical effect. We no longer live forever, and we get sick and stuff. The second is our mental state is deteriorated. We're forced to use propositional reasoning. We're forced to use dialectic. We have to use arguments. There's a sense in Agrippa's text that prior to this, we had a kind of perfect mental picture of the world. Now we have a kind of fallen, foggy, our memory fails, we make mental mistakes. There's a kind of mental deterioration that happens as a result of the fall. And of course, the spiritual effect is that we are alienated from God. And we try to come to know God through reason. This is, of course, a failed idea. And by coming to try to know God through reason, we distance ourselves even further from the divine. So there is some sense in which there's a threefold failure. Notice that threefold failure maps back onto the three books of occult philosophy, right, with the terrestrial world, the celestial world, and the spiritual world, the divine world. So again, we're getting threes again because Christians love to do things in threes, and Agrippa loves to do things in three as well. Lastly, Agrippa will compose in 1526 his book on the sacrament of marriage. Um, and it's here, right, that he actually introduces he somewhat softens his position a little bit. This is a very short essay that he writes, where he argues that um, that basically the way that God protects us from lust, fornicatio, is through the instituting of marriage, and by instituting marriage, we can have sexual carnal relations. And again, this is very heteronormative, but we can have carnal relations in the confines the confines of matrimony, and in that way, we are able to engage in sex, but we're able to engage in sex that is able to avoid the sin of fornicatio. So this again allows us to engage in sexual, in the sexuality in a way that is not inherently fornicative, and therefore is a hedge against this most, in Agrippa's mind, terrible perversion of love in a bodily, embodied, carnal form. Two things that are also worth pointing out about the De Sacramento Matrimonii is one, Agrippa's pretty enthusiastic about physical sex. He's pretty clear about the fact that the physicality of having sex is not bad insofar as it is not fornicatio, and so he's pretty enthusiastic about the carnality of sex. So there's that. And secondly, again, he's at Metz, and one of the things he argues is that if in the marriage a person in the marriage commits adultery, if they use sexuality outside of the marriage in a way that is fornication, that breaks the container that is matrimony, and that might be grounds for dissolving a marriage. Now, for my Catholics in the room, you'll know, red flag. You can't. There is no grounds for dissolving a marriage. You can say that a marriage was never right to begin with, but there can't be a grounds for divorce. And it seems like Agrippa's arguing that fornicatio so breaks the sacrament of matrimony that basically that dissolves the marriage. And therefore, the act of adultery dissolves the marriage, and the people are somehow no longer married. This is extremely controversial, very controversial. And in the rise of the Protestant Reformation, as you probably know, right, Henry VIII and all this is the kind of argument that he's going to be using. And there's some argument to be made here that Agrippa is wading into these waters about what to do with marriage. Can marriage be dissolved? What happens if you have to get an annulment? Is annulment the only way to dissolve the sacrament of marriage? Agrippa goes into this while he's in Metz, and I think it's unsurprising that he does this in the context of Metz, because these are the exact same kinds of conversations that Protestants were having there at the time about what to do with the sacraments. Because if the sacrament is instituted by the church, can it be undone? What can undo it? And for Agrippa, the sin of fornicatio is so profound that it does seem to have the ability to break what the church has put together in the form of the sacrament of marriage. So this is, again, theologically a quite controversial position, a position we would have no controversy with now, but we are also not living in the cauldron, in the crucible that was the mid 1520s. Again, 1525 represents the high point of the peasant rebellions led by Thomas Müntzer. So again, we're living in the heyday, the huge eruption of the social, theological, and political eruption that was Protestantism. 1526, folks, we're there. We're there. And 1526, the summer of 1526, this is where everything's going to go terribly wrong for Agrippa. We'll come back to it next week and discuss it in more detail. But recall, this is where Agrippa is now left Metz. He's now in the court there in France. And Agrippa bungles his situation at court spectacularly, so much so that he basically gets put under a kind of quasi arrest. He's not paid. He badmouths the queen mother behind her back. He gets caught. It's just a disaster. And in the summer of 1526, Agrippa really hits what is in many ways the low point of his life. And it's in that low point, in the doldrums of the summer in France of 1526, that he's going to compose his vicious attack on all the arts and sciences, the De Incertitudine et Vanitate. And it's going to be in that text, where we'll come back to next week, that he's going to lay into magic. He's going to lay into magic in several chapters that we'll focus on next time. And at the same time that he does that, Agrippa also writes a book on geomancy. He writes a short essay on geomancy. So we're going to take a look at the text on geomancy. It's the only book, by the way, that Agrippa ever wrote specifically on one form of divination or magic. He writes this book on geomancy that we're pretty sure he wrote. So we'll take a look at the work on geomancy briefly, and then we're going to look particularly at the big sort of epistemological moves that he makes in the De Incertitudine, and then specifically we're going to zoom in on the sections where he takes to task things like Goetia, Kabbalah, natural magic, witchcraft, etc. So we'll take a look at those sections where he really lays into those issues as well. But next week we turn our attention to the summer of 26, the skeptical summer of 26, and then we're going to begin to have to do the hard work of figuring out what to do with that, because again, from 26 31, Agrippa will publish the first updated book of occult philosophy in 1533. He'll publish the entirety of the three books of occult philosophy as we know them, and then he will promptly die in 1535. So we are and December 26, we are in the last decade of Agrippa's life, and it is going to be an action-packed decade. But before we get to the 1533, we're going to have to see what's going on in the famed and infamous De Incertitudine, which we will turn to next week.